Hello. Welcome to the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. It's brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants, the unified voice of the AICPA and CIMA. I'm Colette Sharbaugh, and I'm part of the team in our Washington, D.C. office. Every week here on the podcast, you'll get insights from inside the accounting and finance profession that help you stay ahead of the curve, whatever business you're in. This means we talk to accounting and finance experts about tech, business skills, personal development, and leadership, but we focus on how it can help you do what you do. Over the last month, we've been reflecting our global community's focus on the coronavirus pandemic, and we've been doing that across the AICPA and CIMA's global touchpoints. In addition to creating dedicated online resource centers, which we've linked to in the show notes to this episode, we've used blogs, social media updates, podcasts, and live-streamed video webinars, including the one that you're about to hear. Originally broadcast live on April 9th, this webcast explored methodologies for effective scenario planning and strategic modeling. It featured Ash Noah, Managing Director of CGMA Learning, Education, and Development at the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants, in conversation with Marc Seewald, an Enterprise Performance Management Specialist at Oracle Corporation. It's just an hour long, but still provides a deep dive into techniques you can use right now as you look to marshal your current resources around your action plan, as well as get out in front of changes to your business and industry in a post-COVID world. Remember, if you need further guidance or resources, go to AICPA.org or CIMAglobal.com and search from there for whatever you're looking for. And open this episode's show notes in your podcast app to find links to everything we've talked about. So, for episode 106 of the Go Beyond Disruption podcast, let's get to that conversation with the association's Ash Noah and Oracle's Marc Seewald.
Colette, thanks very much. Delighted to join you all today and talk about scenario planning and how scenario planning can really help you with the situation that we are facing today. This is part 2 of the series of webinars, and we are all, at this point in time, adjusting to the new normal, even as the social landscape is changing and the business landscape is changing due to COVID-19. When we are in a situation where every underlying business driver, almost every underlying business driver, and business as usual assumptions is actually open to challenge, there is clearly a lack of historic data that one would normally go to. That type of trend to project forward and to look forward is missing. What we really want to focus on here today is the scenario planning tool, the scenario planning process, and how this can really help you where we find ourselves today. This would give you a deeper dive into scenario planning, give you some idea about the role you play in this really value-creating exercise, also understand the power of the scenario planning tool that I'm delighted that Marc is going to present. So I am joined by Marc Seewald, who's the VP of Product Management at Oracle. He has over 20 years of experience in EPM, in Enterprise Performance Management. And I really am looking forward to this. I've learned a lot from him already, and the insights he has is really going to help us today. So over to you, Marc. I'll just ask you to say a few words, introduce yourself, and then pass it back to me.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Ash. Again, really thrilled to be here with you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about this topic here in this presentation with you. Just a little bit more about myself. As mentioned, I work for Oracle. I'm in Oracle's product management organization. I'm based out of our headquarters in suburban San Francisco. And for those of you who may not know what product management does at a software company like Oracle, easiest way to think about it is we're really responsible for the success of our customers with our product. So we spend a lot of time thinking about things like best practices and how can customers be as efficient as possible, effective as possible, as accurate as possible when it comes to planning, budgeting, and forecasting. Things of that nature. So work a lot with our customers on that and try to build that into our tools. Also spend a lot of time thinking about the future of finance. You know, what do emerging technologies bring, and bring to finance, and how will that change how finance does their business in the next 3 to 5 years. But anyhow, I'm happy to be here and really excited to get into the topic, Ash. Thanks.
Marc, thank you for your partnership. And Oracle and AICPA have partnered together several times. Oracle bringing in insights about technology and how technology can be deployed, and the association bringing in the people aspect, the competencies, the sociology of implementation, and creating these competencies for the finance of future. Really great to partner with Oracle, and thank you once again, Marc. So we covered this slide in our last webinar, and what this really shows is where we are today. Most of you would have looked at your business continuity plans. I'm sure you've already taken some immediate actions based on the business impact analysis you would have carried out, and some of you would have also analyzed and updated your risk maps, and taking mitigating actions. But even as you stabilize the current operations, we know there's uncertainty about how the world will change. Some things are not going to go back to normal, and perhaps others will just bounce back very quickly. So the question really to consider is, will your business go back to being business as usual, or is your business going to see a fundamental change in its business model, and the way you serve your customers and the way you retain or gain market share is going to change? So you as a leader in finance, the question to ask is, as we go towards the continuity response and then the recovery response and looking forward, how is it that we should be thinking about enabling our businesses? Yes, obviously, we are going to enable our business to come through the other end, not just survive. But I think it's really time to start thinking about what next and enable the business to thrive into the future. And so when we consider scenario planning, what we are seeing is that our organizations, we can't just have one view of the future that everything is going to come back to normal and it will be business as usual. We cannot place all our bets on just that one outcome. And COVID-19 has really shown us how interconnected the global economic scene is, and it is increasingly complex, and it is increasingly uncertain. So this is an ideal setup for where scenario planning can be deployed. It really is a means for the business to help the business visualize the future and assess how could they respond. How could they respond in different scenarios? And it provides the organization agility and flexibility, and it increases its capability and responsiveness. That's really what scenario planning will do for you. It prepares the business to respond to given scenarios if those scenarios occur. The language of business is finance, and the finance function is really enabling, driving better decision making, providing insights, providing relevant information to drive this optionality, this developing of strategic options as we are looking forward. And finance is really able to clearly demonstrate the cause and effect relationships. That's where we come in. That's where we translate the cause and effect into value. And finance can be that gel. You can be that gel that really brings together the business and conduct this exercise. That can be a really value-adding exercise at this point in time. We know that these are unprecedented times, and so it does require some unprecedented activity. And so I just wanted to hand you over to Marc, and also just address Marc to address the key questions that we're trying to answer through this webinar in terms of scenario planning and how this can be a strength.
Thanks, Ash. So just a little bit of a level set, a little bit about scenario planning and the history before I get into talking a little bit about the key questions and the strengths. But first off, scenario planning as a discipline is not something that's new. This has been, in fact, has been around for centuries. It's been deployed originally in military and farming to run through different scenarios and so forth. So it is something that's been around for a long time. From a corporate finance standpoint, it's probably been around for about 60 years. But what we've really seen is when it comes to scenario planning, and for all the reasons that Ash just explained, is that over the last 20 years, we've really seen a resurgence around companies interested in scenario planning. The obvious areas where you might think about this are these black swan type events like we're going through right now. 20 years ago, we had 9/11 that obviously had major impacts to companies and the economy as a whole. 2008, the financial crisis of 2008. But you might think that, we've been going through 10 years of bull market here. So, why would we need to scenario plan in a bull market? Everything should be rosy. But actually, we've seen a real uptick in this area. We've seen, because of things like globalization, because of things like emerging technology that creates disruption across industries, because of, big competitors like Amazon maybe coming in and disrupting an entire industry. It's important really in good times and in bad to be using a tool like this to help prepare you for the strategy and think through your strategy. And just to address the two final bullets here on the screen to talk about the key questions and really the strengths, I think it answers three core questions. First off is, obviously, what is the big picture? So what is happening maybe from a macro or a microeconomic standpoint? Obviously here in COVID-19, we know what's happening, but what are the likely scenarios? What are the likely scenarios we need to be thinking about? And then second of all, the second question is, how does that impact the enterprise? How does that impact our company or our organization where we need to do this planning? And importantly at this point, I think it really it broadens the scope compared to traditional forecasting. We'll compare and contrast this to traditional planning and forecasting here in a moment, but it really allows you to really kind of decouple from typical assumptions. So, and really start to think about what happens down the line. If it rains in the mountains, it's going to flood in the plains. So, if sales are impacted, how does that impact what we can do with the rest of the organization? So very important. And I think that kind of leads us to the third question that it helps answers. Is really how can we position our enterprise to survive or thrive under the various scenarios that we're working through. So, what are the key KPIs that we should maybe be monitoring? What are the key thresholds that we should be watching? Once we pass a certain threshold, like a level of sales or a level of cash, what actions should we be taking and what we should be considering? So. Really important. I think it's a very powerful tool. It really allows you to test strategy. So let's talk a little bit about best practices and as I go through this, I really want to spend a little time comparing and contrasting scenario planning to make what might be traditional budgeting, forecasting, things of that nature. But importantly, I would really differentiate the two in many different ways. First off, scenario planning tends to be much more top-down in nature. What I mean by that is it typically involves fewer people. It's going to be more strategic in nature. It's going to be the key stakeholders across the enterprise. Certainly finance will play a role in that, but it will be other people outside of finance collaborating together to make a strategy across the entire enterprise. Contrasting that to forecasting and budgeting tends to be more what I would call bottoms up, where you're sending budget templates or your software out to collect data from all kinds of people across the enterprise. That tends to be much more bottoms up in nature. Scenario planning tends to be more modeling or top down in nature. Second point is it's definitely more, it's a higher level, a higher style of planning. So traditionally, when you do a budget, for example, you might be budgeting at many different line items across your income statement and balance sheet. But from a top-down strategic planning or strategic modeling standpoint, it's going to be a little bit higher level, a little more summarized in nature. And that's important because there needs to be speed in this process. Clearly here in a situation like this with COVID-19, if you're running through scenarios, you need to be able to do that quickly. So dealing with a little bit less detail. Also tends to be driver-based. We'll talk a lot about these drivers here in some of the following slides. So what I mean by drivers are what are some of your critical assumptions around the business? What are some of the critical variables assumptions around how much cash you can generate in a period of time, or what percentage of sales is going to be related to costs, or, what's, various number of drivers. Third point is I think it also tends to be very, full trial balance is what I call it. So you really need to be thinking across all three elements of the trial balance: your income statement, your balance sheet, and your cash flow. Again, clearly in a scenario like this, obviously cash is going to be very important. So you don't want to just focus, obviously, on where your sales are going to be. You need to think about things like your supply chain and so forth. Also, just from a best practice standpoint, not necessarily really contrasting to budgeting or forecasting here, but I think, what we see in the marketplace right now in general scenario planning, not necessarily a crisis scenario like this we're in with COVID-19, but in general scenario planning, you do want to keep the numbers of scenarios to a manageable number. You can hear different, everybody will have their opinion on this. I think general guidance is to aim to have about 4 scenarios. In this particular crisis we're going through, you maybe want to consider having a few more, but you don't want to have a number of scenarios where you can't manage it. You should be spending time on each scenario. You need to be able to wrap your head around these scenarios. So it is important to be able to have a manageable number. And also, actually, why 4, not 3? I'll illustrate this point here in a few slides from here. But it tends to be human nature for people to gravitate towards the middle option. If it's between small, medium, and large, people tend to pick medium. So by at least creating a 4th option, you force some thought, and you don't get caught into some groupthink all going to the middle. Next point really revolves around spending equal time on each scenario, and it's closely related to the previous point. But the idea here with scenario planning is not just to come up with a scenario, but it's also to come up with the action plan around that scenario. So it's not just numbers; it's actually a narrative. It's a story that you're going to be telling. In this scenario, if sales shrinks by 50% in this particular crisis, what actions are we going to take at a strategic level, and how should that ripple down through the rest of the exercise? So importantly, if you spend all your time just on the most likely scenario, then you won't be prepared when, one of the outlier scenarios actually happens. So most people might think, for example, maybe we're going to have a moderate or maybe even a long-term impact. But what happens if COVID-19 actually, the summer comes, the sun comes out, and everything is nicer? You want to be prepared for that type of situation. And likewise, you want to be prepared for a longer-term impact. So also, as I go through this, I probably should have said this right up front. These are general rules of thumb, as all best practices are. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We see a high degree of variability between industries. So definitely, take that into consideration as we go through it. I do want to actually spend just a moment talking about, what I would consider the differences are between crisis planning versus a strategic long-range plan. Again, if there's anybody obviously on the webcast who's familiar with your strategic long-range plan, most companies do some sort of long-range plan. Maybe you only revisit that on an annual basis. Maybe you're planning out 3 years, 5 years, depending on your industry. Industries like oil and gas or mining will actually plan out 20 years because they're making big, long capital investments where they expect to generate revenue from. But in crisis planning, you really need to start from a different point. So the strategic LRP might be a good place to start from, but you don't want to just take that and run. You really probably need to put a little more thought into it. First off is the shorter term focus. In the long range planning, what we tend to see is people plan in buckets of maybe half years or quarters or years. Right now, I think in a crisis planning scenario like this, I think we need to think a little bit shorter term, maybe planning in months or possibly even in weeks for the first 6 months, something of that nature. And again, everybody's requirements will be a little bit different. Also the drivers, and again, we're going to get into the driver in a lot more detail here in a moment, but, you can't assume anything in a crisis scenario like this. Typically, you might take your supply chain for granted. So your primary driver, if you're in an agribusiness, for example, is going to be, prices and demand. But, if because of COVID-19, if your workforce is shrinking, people are having absenteeism because of, illnesses, then that could have impact on your supply chain. So supply chain considerations might become a key driver. And then last but not least is just frequency around update. Again, if you take a look at a LRP, most companies today probably are only revisiting that strategic LRP on maybe an annual basis. I'd say best practice is probably at the least a quarterly basis, but very few organizations are looking at it on a very frequent basis. Clearly, in a crisis, you need to be revisiting this constantly. I would suggest obviously at the very least, strategic stakeholders should be getting together on a weekly basis to be reviewing kind of key assumptions in your scenario planning. So hopefully that gives you a little insight. We could go on forever in that, but
you make some really, really good points. And when we think about the degree of uncertainty being really high and predictability being really low, this is an ideal platform for scenario planning. And so I wanted to just add some color with an example. At the association, we deliver the Chartered Global Management Accounting exams globally, worldwide. And all our examination centers had to be shut down. Now, the scenario of how do we continue to serve our customers, how do students continue to take their exams, we've actually now changed with the same provider, using the same supply chain, to online remote proctored exams. And so having pivoted and given the customers that flexibility that they can now actually take exams in a secure environment from home, will we ever go back to physical examination centers? And that certainty is not very sure. So we have to work on scenarios that in some parts of the world, there might be candidates who really prefer to still go to an examination center, either because of technical issues or because of habit. So this type of scenario, when things come back to normal, how do we then plan a scenario? Is it going to be online? Is it going to be a mix? And some movies are now available online instead of opening up in theaters. So what is the future? Will the future be theaters and online opening the big day, or will it just be theaters? So these are some examples of scenarios that people will be working through as we proceed in these coming weeks and months. We created this tool in 2015, so it's 5 years old, but it is a really useful tool in terms of the steps you need to take to come up with a robust scenario plan. And we're just going to use this framework to walk you through the process of creating a plan.
Obviously, this is, I think, a really useful tool. I've seen a number of different tools out in the marketplace, 8-step tools, 6-step tools, but I think this is as useful as any of them. And really, just let's talk through each one of these steps. Also, as we go through the rest of the presentation, I think we'll kind of fill in a little more color around each one of these steps, and we'll revisit this slide at the end to make sure that kind of is made clear. But in step one, you're defining the scope, the issues, the time horizon, and I kind of alluded to some of that in the previous slide. We obviously in this situation, we all certainly know what the issue is that we're facing, and as I talked about, this tends to be a little bit shorter time horizon that we're going to be doing some scenario planning on. So instead of a 3 or 5 year plan, you might still want to be thinking out 3 or 5 year plans to take advantage of opportunities like Ash talked about. But, you're going to be shifting left a little bit of your focus. Instead of looking out to that 4th and 5th year, you're going to be spending a lot of time up here in that next 6 months and, 9 months, 12 months to really consider the impact on the organization. Defining the key drivers, I think that's key. We'll actually talk about that in 2 slides here. We'll be talking about some of the key drivers. Again, I gave that example of, in agribusiness, you might have thought about the commodity prices and demand, but now you have to think about things like supply chain. So selecting your drivers is going to be really important. I think we'll drive that point here home in a moment. Third point, and I think this is important, I think in preparing to do scenario analysis or scenario planning, there's a lot of information you need to collect, a lot of qualitative information, a lot of quantitative information, as well as internal information and external third-party type information. So just to give you a few examples of that, there is a wealth of information out there on the internet right now. You can go out and collect information around macroeconomic impacts or potential macroeconomic impacts because of a pandemic like this. A good example of that, and I believe we provide the link in the resources page at the end of this presentation, Harvard Business Review did a really interesting analysis recently around past pandemics. There's never been a pandemic quite like this one, but they've done an analysis of past pandemics and what tends to happen in those pandemics. You may have already heard the term V-shaped recession or V-shaped recovery or U-shaped recovery already thrown out, but it dives into some of those considerations. So you can have surprisingly fast returns from recessions in some cases. Again, obviously we're in a very unique situation, but that's the kind of information you want to start collecting to share with those key stakeholders so you can have a good discussion around that. Likewise, clearly there's things internally you need to start thinking about. What is, when it comes to A&R aging, what are the typical collection rates that you've had in the past? And, how is that going to be impacted going forward? I've talked with a number of our customers who actually have done some good bottoms-up analysis. Maybe and these particular customers tended to be in business-to-business type industries. So they wanted to look almost customer by customer and start to estimate whether they could what the likelihood of being able to either continue to sell that customer or if that customer is able to pay for any kind of the services or product that they've already done. So information like that is important to collect ahead of time, and that feeds into the scenario planning process.
Can I just clarify something
Please?
here? When we are talking about data and collecting data, one of the challenges at this point in time is the lack of availability of past data. You did mention there are some similar kind of recovery patterns we could go back to, but no one's really seen the scale of disruption and this type of a lockdown in our lifetimes. It could have been the Great Depression of the 30s. People are talking about how severely the GDP and the economy is going to contract, etc. So there are some really a wide range of probabilities and outcomes. And so you mentioned, qualitative and quantitative. Perhaps it's a time where we're really looking at higher level data and more qualitative type assumptions rather than data-driven, really detailed data-driven analysis. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Absolutely. I mean, in my opinion, it's always a blend of the two. You will be limited in the amount of hard data you're going to be able to find because there's not a strong precedent, obviously. But you do want to understand what the historical patterns of the business have been doing. That may not be immediately at the top of mind for every one of the key stakeholders. So it is important to refresh key stakeholders with past performance. And then you combine that with that external data. And again, you won't be able to perfectly predict anything, but you can start by thinking through possible ranges. And that's precisely the value of what, this developing a scenario brings you. And that actually brings a perfect segue into the fourth point, is that developing that scenario, we talked about, is it 4 scenarios, is it 5 scenarios? Again, that'll depend on your specific fact pattern, but it is important to think through the different likely scenarios. So, is it a combination of, sales and supply chain, or do you want to just think about, primarily your sales and cash considerations, and what are the various permutations that matter most to you? And it is important, if you start thinking about all the different variables here, there's tons of uncertainty, the number of permutations can be significant, but you really need to, as a group, come together and think through, what the kind of the most likely or the most important scenarios that you should be really planning through. On the fifth point, applying the scenarios, I think the key thing it's important here is that, once you've agreed upon what the scenarios should be, you really need to test those strategies. What is the downstream impact? What are the key metrics you want to monitor? What's the threshold for each one of those metrics by which you want to start to take action on something, or maybe start considering a different scenario? And you want to, obviously, as I mentioned, spend time on every one of those scenarios. As a part of it, we recommend you not just work on the numbers, work on the narrative, work on the story that goes with this. You're putting together a plan that ultimately will help guide the rest of the enterprise, the rest of the operations, to make their own sub-plans and execute at their different varying levels across the organization. And then the sixth point is really just around maintaining and updating this. Again, in a situation like now, obviously you want to be looking at this on a very regular basis. You might also want to consider kind of how this might impact your bottoms-up forecasting. If you were just doing a quarterly forecast in the past, you might want to think about doing monthly or weekly flash reporting to start bringing in some information around some of these metrics, so you can be very quick to respond to any kind of changes in some key metrics.
I just thought I'd ask a quick question from the audience. So when we're looking at these scenarios and building these scenarios, we obviously need to think about human behavior. For example, even if COVID clears up over the summer, how will the general public react, and what will the new normal be? And so, what we're looking at is not just economic outcome, but it's a socio-economic type of convergence. There's the whole social aspect of behavior and how that'll impact future spending, future behavior, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought the question really lends to what you're going to talk about in terms of that is exactly why we are talking about scenarios, right?
That's exactly right. There's lots of variables here. There's variables across the customers you sell to, whether you're in a B2B type style business or whether you're in business to consumer versus business to business type industry. There's lots of variables, and I think breaking that down and working thoughtfully through each one of those scenarios is key. And again, we'll try to give you some good examples of that, and hopefully it'll start to illustrate some of this. We wanted to give you some examples to start thinking through, and I think there's one example of maybe your organization's one of the big key drivers of the way you need to slice your scenario planning is across key geographies or key marketplaces. On the right-hand side is, different manners in which you're selling. So different sales channels, for example. Another way of depicting this is, and we'll give you an example of that in a moment here, is maybe thinking about how the impact across different product lines. So, various ways that you can be thinking through this from a planning perspective. So with that, a couple of key considerations. Number one, consider uneven impacts across the business. And that's where some of this third-party information might become helpful. Clearly you might have, in Europe, you might have a different impact than what you're going to see in Latin America compared to North America. So make assumptions, at that level of detail in your scenario planning tool, whatever that is, whether it's Excel or whatnot. Also, hopefully this illustrates the need for a high-level model. If you get too caught up in the weeds, it's going to be very difficult to run through all the different scenarios. So keep it summarized. Don't get a too granular level of detail in your income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow. Try to keep it driver-based. Third scenario, and that's precisely why we created it. You'll notice in this example here, we're showing you 4 different scenarios: a fast recovery, a moderate recovery with disruption to the supply chain, and so forth. So this hopefully illustrates some of the value of 4 scenarios. Again, it's human nature to tend to kind of gravitate towards that middle scenario, moderate. So at the very least, if you can have a few different flavors there in that middle scenario, it forces people to really think, and it forces discussion amongst those stakeholders that are going to be involved with this process. And we've been talking about drivers and variables. I just want to give you some examples of that, some kind of very solid examples that help you start to think of this if you're not familiar with it in your business. On the left-hand side, you can see examples of external drivers. These tend to be macroeconomic in nature, and they're not going to be relevant for every business. They're not going to be relevant for every industry. So if we just look at some examples of this, in banking, certainly things like inflation rates are going to be very relevant. Interest rates are going to be very relevant. In oil and gas, GDP growth or GDP contraction, commodity prices, that'll be very relevant. So, industry by industry, you really need to think about these things. Certainly, I think market size obviously will impact just about every one of the, industries. Are there sections of the market that are growing, even under these scenarios? In certain industries, are there sections of the market that are shrinking, and by what relative shape? So those are some of the drivers. I will point out that, again, I think for some industries, it's very difficult to use metrics like that. Again, in other industries like oil and gas, it's very straightforward. So if you're in one of those industries where it doesn't have a direct correlation, just use that as kind of a guide in more of kind of a qualitative function as opposed to a quantitative. In the key business variables, I think this is really where it's interesting. Every industry, again, is going to have different assumptions. Certainly in manufacturing, assumptions around, in typical long-range planning, you'll be making assumptions around product productivity and quality. The quality of your manufacturing lines are going to have a big impact on the success you're having in the marketplace. The cost structure could be an important consideration. As you're investing in some CapEx over time, is that lowering your cost structure? Is that making you more efficient to deliver services to your customers? So that would be an important driver. The last point, I think is important because I think it's actually a quick way in this kind of scenario, in the COVID-19 situation we're in, you may not be able to think about some of those other more traditional drivers. So I think customer segmentation is an important way to think about it. Again, we've been working with some of our customers who are, maybe they can't easily think about things customer by customer, but can you start to understand across your customer base how many customers and how much revenue do you have in certain industries, and then start making assumptions. So if you have 20% of your business you're selling into the travel and entertainment industry or airlines, that you're not likely going to be making a lot of revenue in the short term, at least from those industries. So you can start to make some key assumptions. And then just to drive a point home, I'll give you an example here in our business in software. Oracle actually has a number of different product lines. We sell hardware, software, and services. But for software, one of the important drivers for us is renewal rates. We sell software and contracts that, 3 or 4 year terms. And, the important correlating driver for us is customer satisfaction, because we know customer satisfaction is correlated strongly with renewal rates. So that is a key driver in our business. So anyhow, really coming up with the correct logic, I think is very important.
Mark, just on the previous slide, there was a question, what do these NA, LAD, EMEA, APAC mean? These are just geographies: North America, Latin America, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia Pacific, I'm imagining. There was a question on that, so just clarifying that when you're looking at scenarios, maybe you take your largest pieces of the business unit by geography, or you look at your total company and you look at lines of businesses, retail, online, wholesale, etc. So these are just two dimensions of how you might want to create your scenarios.
That's correct. And dimensions is a great way of thinking about it. Okay, so let's get into some concrete examples here. Obviously, I'll talk a little bit about some of the capability that our products do from a scenario planning and strategic modeling, but anything I'm showing you here could also be done in Excel spreadsheets. So everything is it could be done obviously in Excel. So it doesn't have to be done in an enterprise software from a vendor like Oracle. But what you're seeing here is a good example of modeling drivers. And I've been talking about these drivers here for a while. Across the top of the screen, first, just to explain what you're looking at. You'll see a number of tabs: the strategic plan, the income statement, the balance sheet, the cash flow, so forth, gross profit. You can think of those as the tabs of your spreadsheet. If you're doing this in a spreadsheet, you're going to have a lot of tabs to get into some detail here around your assumptions. Also below that, North America, you'll see a little drop box that says scenario. What that is that's where you can quickly change scenarios. So I could be working on my base scenario and quickly change. What you'd likely be doing from an Excel spreadsheet standpoint is having different Excel spreadsheets to do that. So each spreadsheet would be a different scenario. And here is just a really good example. It may be hard to see on the screen if this is relatively small, but you'll see the math that this particular company shows. It says, how much, what's the size of the general industry sales? And you can make estimates on what the whole industry is making from a standpoint. And is there relative growth in that industry? Is it actually contracting here in 2020? And then a driver would be an assumption around like market share. So once you use that market share assumption, that calculates obviously your share of revenue. And then down below, you see how it's math is we're taking that share of revenue, and we're making assumptions on how that will be split across product lines. So that math may not be completely transparent to you, but I think that's a really good example of driver-based modeling. If you get into this bottoms-up style of going customer by customer, or if you're going by a very detailed sales funnel, you can really be caught in the weeds very quickly. I think modeling at a more summarized level of detail is important, because it obviously allows you to do speed. Another important point, don't be doing planning down if you have a lot of different products you sell, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, certainly you don't want to be doing planning at that individual product level. You really want to be thinking maybe at product lines. So just an example, I talked a little bit about the differences between industries like business to consumer versus business to business, but this hopefully gives you a visual on what modeling of a driver looks like.
So what you're saying is keep the drivers high level. If you think about a restaurant business, for example, don't go down to every type of meal and the revenue from each type of meal, but perhaps just go at the level of lunch and dinner. And how will it impact my lunch? How will it impact my dinner? How will it impact, or will it impact the weekend versus the weekday in terms of the relaxing of the rules as the rules come out? Maybe the social distancing rules for the next 6 months is that your restaurant runs at half the capacity because you have to keep the 6 feet distance going forward. So some of these should be done at that high level rather than getting into the granular detail of which meal and what dollar per meal, etc. Am I getting that right?
That's absolutely correct. So in that case, the number of guests coming through the door is a perfect example of drivers, and flexing that number in different scenarios is precisely correct. It really, obviously, if you're developing your scenario planning in Excel, even though you might have a different spreadsheet for each one of your scenarios, you're going to want to try to bring these together and view these side by side. I don't think this is very difficult to understand. This is pretty obvious. And again, here we're showing 3 scenarios. You may need to have 5 scenarios. Maybe it's the 4 scenarios, like best practice. But importantly, you should easily be able to create new scenarios. I think actually, certainly when I'm working through scenarios for our own business, I like to create a couple of sandbox scenarios. So I might have my official formal 3 or 4 scenarios, but I'll create a couple sandbox scenarios where I test some strategies myself or collaboratively when I'm working with a colleague. So in this example here, you can see in our product, we have something called Scenario Manager. Very easy to go in and add a new scenario. Obviously, if you're doing this in spreadsheets, you'd be just saving a copy of one of your scenarios and starting on a fresh version of your spreadsheet. As I've talked about, this should be full trial balance modeling. It shouldn't be just income statement. It shouldn't just be cash. Balance sheet is hugely important. I don't need to tell a bunch of finance folks that, but there's going to be impacts all across it. Obviously impacts from a kind of working capital standpoint, your customer's ability to pay. I think you need to take into consideration things around, what's the impact of potential stimulus. Depending on where your business is operated, here in the U.S. we have the CARES Act and a bunch of state and local level type stimulus packages as well. Similar kinds of stimulus will be taking place around the world. So in certain states, for example, I know there's some working capital access programs that you might be able to flex and run some assumptions around. Also is on the balance sheet, obviously capital expenditure. You're making some pretty big investments currently, probably before the crisis. What are some of those CapEx projects that you might be putting on hold or stopping entirely, or what are the most crucial ones that you're going to be moving forward with? Taxes is another good consideration. Taxes again is going to have an impact potentially from stimulus packages. There might be additional tax incentives or tax credits that are made available. So you'll need to flex through those assumptions. The tax liability is a pretty material number. So you'll need to have your tax department involved with that. And then of course, capital structure. And that's actually what we're trying to show here. Clearly in a webcast like this, we can't go through everything, but in our software, we have capability like our our funding options tool, which really allows you to make assumptions around things like, what to do with excess cash or what to do with, when you need to fund cash deficits. Again, in a scenario like this, we'll probably be spending more time in funding cash deficits. But you can see here what it allows you to do is give you a priority on what, where you're going to get those sources of cash. Is it going to be coming from marketable securities, short-term debt, long-term debt, and specifically what order you want to kind of exhaust those different pools of funding and so forth. So, that's the same kind of thing you probably want to build into a spreadsheet. You'll want to have maybe a tab just to focus on funding or debt scheduling, things of that nature. And I kind of alluded to this. This is a good example of more of a bottoms-up style of reforecasting. So you still might be able to complement your top-down scenario planning with more of a traditional weekly or monthly reanalysis or reevaluation of your forecasts using your whatever planning and budgeting tool or process you have in place. And it can be used to sanity check your scenarios. So you'll see in this particular example that there's a lot more account detail of the operating expense. In your scenario planning, you want to be very summarized and your assumptions around operating expenses. But when you do a reforecast, maybe you want to do the sanity check that what's the operations think is the bare minimum they can operate under given the certain scenario that you're moving forward on. So just one good example.
So again, very high level, what we've got perhaps wages and salaries, you're looking at percentage of full-time versus part-time, or looking at the percentage of workforce required for a given level of output. So very high level type HCM planning for that first line that you're showing.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So that's a really good point. It's not, I think you need to think about all the considerations around this. Typically most organizations are not going to just plan at a total compensation expense. They're probably going to be planning at a more granular level of detail. So information coming out of your HR tool to give you, full insight into all your costs related to the workforce, not just compensation, but benefits and taxes, things of that nature, and then modeling from there. So again, I think it's a good example of where your scenario plan will be connected to that bottoms-up style plan.
So there's a comment here, Mark, that it seems to one of the viewers that the idea of scenario planning we're talking about is just a sensitivity analysis. And isn't a scenario supposed to be a story, and shouldn't there be a narrative that drives the data and not the other way around? I just ask you to comment on that, and now I've got a couple of points to make as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's preaching to the choir there. It's absolutely, I think, the case. I did allude to that earlier, but maybe went through it a little quicker than appropriate. It shouldn't just be the numbers. When you're coming up with a scenario, there should be the critical assumptions related to that scenario. It should be the whole story you're telling around that scenario, as well as the expected actions you plan to take in that scenario. So, and those aren't just a bunch of numbers in a spreadsheet. Those are paragraphs of narrative that go along with that scenario. So it's absolutely a key point and, absolutely an important part of the process.
Right. But at the end of the day, we still have to translate it into an impact that the business understands. And if we are able to translate it into the balance sheet impact, the P&L impact for these different scenarios, that really helps two things. One, it helps you have that conversation and makes the conversation really robust. But then it also forces you to reconsider your assumptions in the scenario as you look at the outcomes. So it really is an iterative process. And unless you have the translation into some measure of value, it will be hard to complete your scenario planning.
That's exactly right. So, again, this is a feature within the Oracle product, but it's an important thing. You don't need to use an Oracle product here to do any of this, what we're talking about. You can be using spreadsheets to do all of this. So it is important to point out here. This is we're using this to kind of illustrate some examples of what you should be doing. I don't encourage you to run out and try to purposely educate yourself on this particular capability, but there's something called Monte Carlo simulations. It is an approach to long-range planning, in particular scenario planning, to help you more accurately deal with uncertainty. It is used broadly in industries like banking. In banking, after the 2008 crisis, all banks have to go through scenario testing to test their liquidity ratios and whatnot. Banks use technology like simulations. You can use simulations within Excel spreadsheets. So it is capability that you don't need an enterprise software, but it's really valuable in just de-risking those assumptions. And, without going through all the examples, what you're seeing on the left-hand side of the page is running through 500 simulations, right, of testing different ranges of outcomes. So your first assumption might be market demand. Maybe you think the market demand is going to be somewhere between 3 billion and 5 billion for your products or services, with most likely being 7 billion. How can you quickly test all of those assumptions? So that's what a simulation can do. And again, you don't need to use an Oracle product. You can do that in Excel spreadsheets. So just I'll finish here with some thoughts on some considerations. I'll start by talking about some of the COVID-19 specific considerations, and I'll finish with some common challenges. Don't overly focus on the negative is the first thing I would say. And I think Ash has alluded to that, and I know Ash wants to expand on that as well. There could be some silver lining in this. There's always opportunity in crisis. So, that's definitely one of the first considerations. Ash, you want to expand on that?
Yeah, right. We talked about pivoting and serving your customers in new ways. And how does that permanently change your customer expectations? There's a lot of banks that are now providing drive-by services, and people who prefer to walk in are just driving by. So is that now, you need to consider, is that behavior going to change going forward, that people now understand the convenience of working from home, understand the convenience of being able to deliver the normal level of productivity electronically, or just driving by and not having to walk in? Does that change your business model? And so developing that scenario is a great example of where the narrative is driving the outcomes rather than the outcomes driving the narrative.
Exactly. And the next two bullets we've kind of touched on already, impact of workforce from prolonged social distancing. What I'd point out there is you might already have a business continuity plan, but that business continuity plan probably did not take into consideration some of the impacts of social distancing. So, don't just fall back on that business continuity plan when it comes to considerations around workforce. You may need to revisit that. Also, on the third point, the timing and the size of the government stimulus. Unfortunately, we can't always predict what our governments will be doing for us. So, those are things you're going to need to take into consideration. When it comes to common challenges, and what I mean by common challenges is like, whether it's you're doing a scenario planning for this crisis, or whether you're doing the scenario planning for more strategic long-term purposes, later on, communication is key. And that goes back to the question that was asked around the narrative and the story that goes with this. It's not just sending out the numbers that you need to hit. You clearly need to tell that story. Also, second bullet, learning from your mistakes. I'd point out, don't be like a deer in headlights. It's impossible to pick a precise number that you're working towards, but pick a range and make some assumptions around the right number, and you can adjust that as you work forward and move forward in this crisis. So, you're going to learn from these mistakes and just do the best up front and move forward. That kind of makes the third bullet, somewhat the same there. Don't be overwhelmed. Talked about it also in the beginning. Don't overly focus on a single scenario. And then the last point we haven't really touched on is, consider human bias. And what I mean by that is people tend to be overly optimistic going into a recession. It won't get this deep. And they also tend to be overly pessimistic coming out of a recession. People assume it'll, once you're in the bottom, you assume it's going to last a lot longer than it does. But, we've had pandemics in the past. We've had depressions. We've had recessions. We are going to come out of this. So don't be overly pessimistic either. So in the interest of time, again, I think, we've gone through these 6 points, and I think this is a great resource that we've, that is available, obviously, on CGMA website there. So it's a wonderful tool. We've gone through some of the points of how you define the scope and what the use of key drivers are and how to collect data. So I would encourage you all to download that. And there's a lot of other good content behind it. And, I think hopefully some of the best practices we've shared will make sense along with some of that content in this tool.
Yeah, there've been a few questions about, do we actually have a template on Excel, or do we have a template for small businesses to use? We do not. So it's really a matter of identifying your drivers at a high level and creating these scenarios. The spreadsheets can be used, but I will take that away as some homework and see if there's a simple Excel tool that's available. The other question was around thinking of some drivers for the education industry. Let me just check. It said specifically around higher education. I know you've got some higher education clients. Have you come across any examples of perhaps drivers they should be thinking about for their scenario planning? To me, one big one is online education versus brick and mortar classroom. How does that model out? Anything else, Marc?
Yeah, I think the key driver is actually enrollment. So whether it's brick and mortar, whether it's online, are two different channels for the same service that you're providing. So enrollment is kind of the key driver in higher education. And then there are clearly going to be very kind of non-industry specific drivers that are appropriate when you make assumptions around cash and expenses and things of that nature. But again, every industry has their unique requirements.
Yeah, but when you're thinking about a scenario as we go forward, how is higher education going to be impacted, and what kind of scenarios should they be modeling? A key driver, you're right, is enrollment, and then whether people prefer to, and whether your enrollment goes up in one format or the other will have knock-on effects on your supply chain and how you provide that. So you look at your supply chain, you look at the drivers around your acquisition of the students, and then how you deliver it. And when you look at the whole end-to-end delivery, you can come up with your own drivers as to how your revenues and costs will change, and then that provides you links to your balance sheet, cash flow, etc.
So, in summary, I think we probably, made all these points, but, finance plays a very important role here. It's not all on your shoulders within finance. Clearly finance should be collaborating with key stakeholders. It is going to be a little bit smaller group in scenario planning, but, finance plays an important role. We're not on the front lines of this crisis, but, finance is absolutely playing a critical role in helping us navigate through these trying times. So, recognize that you're playing a very important role if you're involved with this. And do recognize if you're not familiar with scenario planning, it is very powerful. I do encourage you to do some more research around best practices. I think you'll find if you use those best practices, they've been developed over decades, and you'll find a lot more success with that. If you do stray too far from best practices, you'll end up getting in some wormholes and so forth. So, do try to be conscious of that. And, and we've made this point already. It's, the sun will come out here, guys. There's opportunity. It's not all negative. Keep that in mind as you go forward.
So consider your finance function, that you have an unprecedented opportunity to add value to your business, to really move from you being looked at as a cost center to really coming out, adding that narrative to what we've been talking about in terms of scenario planning, bringing together a group that can address these various scenarios to start to make some strategic decisions as you move forward. This resource I wanted to point out as well in terms of the Agile Finance Unleashed. It gives you some really good ideas around how technology can help you. And we are here at CGMA to help you with the element of competencies and building competencies within your finance teams. Please do access these resources that are provided for free for members, and some of these are open to non-members as well. Really good hub to go to for the latest information and guidance that you need. Thank you for being here, and really appreciate you joining us. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Disruption, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. Learn more about today's topic at AICPA-CIMA.com/disruption. This podcast is designed to provide illustrative information with respect to the subject matter covered and does not represent an official opinion or position of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. It is provided with the understanding that the association, its affiliates, and subsidiaries are not engaged in rendering legal, accounting, or other professional services. If such advice or expert assistance is required, the services of a competent professional person should be sought. The association, its subsidiaries, and affiliates make no representations, warranties, or guarantees as to and assume no responsibility for the content or application of the material contained herein and expressly disclaim all liability for such damages arising out of the use of, reference to, or reliance on such material.